Hello, and welcome to the Jeoffrey Sarpong podcast. My guest today is Dr. Rebecca Sear. Dr. Sear is a professor of psychology at Brunel University of London and director of the Center for Culture and Evolution. She studies how families, health, and culture shapes our lives, looking at things like fertility, child health, family relationships, and other inequalities. Dr. Rebecca Sear, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you for being here. So let's get right into it. And before we start going into the details, I would like to start from the beginning. So, from an anthropological point of view, what is the purpose of family?
So, what a family is a group of individuals working together to ensure their health, the thriving of everyone concerned, and to raise children successfully. So, a family is quite important in our species. My background is in biology, and I take an evolutionary approach. And if you look at how humans organize our lives compared to other species, the family is really quite important. So compare humans to a cat. My cat Gatsby is sitting on the windowsill right now. Cats are a solitary species. They don't live in family groups. They hunt alone, mothers raise their kittens alone, and then they send them out into the world. Humans are really different. We raise children in cooperative groups. So we have the father's involvement is really important in humans, but also grandparental involvement is really important for raising kids, as well as other family members and other group members as well. We rely a lot more on the family in humans than many other species. It's really important for us.
Mm. And from that perspective, then, still from the evolutionary perspective, in the past, or when we were forming these families, how important do you think that was to our kind of building societies? Does it start from a family then builds outwards, do you think?
Absolutely. So family relationships allow us to develop skills in cooperation, in cooperating with one another. We can't really build complex societies. All of the achievements that humans have achieved really come back to us being a cooperative species. We interact with a lot with each other. We learn from each other. This is really important. Cats, again, they can't create complex societies because they're not interacting with one another. They don't have those skills. And families are where we learn those skills. It's really important to the way we are as a species.
And how do you think it has changed over time? The idea of families. I know we've now got very different forms of family. We have the nuclear family, extending the communal. Talk to me about the evolution of the structures of families over time.
So first thing to say is that the family is quite flexible in our species. If you look throughout history and across different societies now, the way people organize their family life can be quite different. We always have these family relationships, but who those relationships are with varies a bit. For example, in some families, it's the father's relationships that are really, or relations, the father family members that are really important. Those are called patrilineal societies. In other societies, it's the mother's relations who have really close relationships with, for example, children. Those are matrilineal societies. We also have different marital forms. We have different marriages. Throughout most of human history, polygyny has been allowed in most society. That means a man can have more than one wife. But there are some societies which are polyandrous, where a woman can have more than one husband. And in fact, most human marriage relationships have been monogamous. Although those polygamous relationships are typically allowed in most societies, they tend to be relatively rare. Most families are based on a monogamous marriage. But there is some variation in what the family looks like across time and between contemporary societies. Having said that, there has definitely been a shift over time towards a more nuclear family form. So if you look at hunter-gatherers, you do have marriage between husbands and wives, but typically many other family members and group members are involved in raising children and hunting together, socializing together. We now tend to live in more nuclear families. There's even a belief that the male breadwinner nuclear family is the traditional family form. So this is completely false. The male breadwinner nuclear family is actually a relatively novel invention in human history, probably associated with the Industrial Revolution. And even today, I don't think the male breadwinner nuclear family form is actually a family form that many families adopt. because we still have a lot of childcare, for example, from grandparents. Grandparents are typically very heavily involved in raising kids. Also, we have formal childcare, schools, all of these other sources of help for families to raise children. So there has been that shift from more from larger families, extended families, to nuclear families. But I think there's been a lot of that is a cultural shift in our belief about what a family looks like rather than reality itself.
I completely agree. And I want to now focus a little bit more about the idea about our beliefs about families, about what we gain from families. Obviously, I know that it's very much love and I feel this genuine love for everyone around me and the families, but I want to understand from an anthropological point of view, what is that feeling that we have? What is that relation we have with our family members? Is that something in us to kind of, is that survival instinct or is that something more?
So I think those feelings, I mean, you can answer it on what sometimes called a proximate level. So that is the sort of immediate mechanism that causes that feeling. And it's probably to do with being raised by all these people. You're very familiar with them. You know, they cared for you as a child. So the sort of proximate answer to that, the immediate reason why we feel those relationships is how we've grown up, that we're surrounded by these people. But to take a step back, I would also think we probably have the capacity for those feelings of love because we are a cooperative species. We have to get on with other people because that's the way we organize our lives. We are most successful when we're cooperating with other people. Again, compare cats. So I actually have two cats and they're sisters, and they used to like each other when they were little kittens. Now they really don't like each other at all. I am not sure there's very much love between them. And that might be because cats are simply not cooperative species. You know, when they're out there in the wild, they're hunting alone. They don't need their sister around there to help them hunt. They're perfectly capable of doing it themselves. In humans, that's not the case. In hunter-gatherer societies, we're much more successful if we hunt in teams, if we gather in teams. And ultimately, it's been a much more successful strategy for us as a species.
That's so fascinating. That is so fascinating that yeah, that because of our social aspects of it, it's even fun, it's even understanding which comes first, actually. The fact that because we're raised as a social in and amongst our communal family, we kind of grow up to be more social also when we become adults. The next question I had was if there's any difference in kind of cultures when it comes to how families kind of interact with each other. Um, is there other universal patterns across cultures when it comes to how families kind of are made up and relate to each other?
I think it's always dangerous to say there are any universal patterns among humans because our behavior is just so flexible. I'm sure if I said this thing is universal, there is some culture somewhere that is not doing that universal thing. So, I mean, I think what's universal is that we all do live in families. We all, yeah, unlike cats, again, we live in family networks. We rely on families. And but although that doesn't necessarily have to be kin relationships, you know, genetic relationships between individuals, there's a belief now that we're forming families with friends and neighbors and those kinds of associations. I think it is important to remember that family members are not necessarily just genetically related to us. Again, I can use an example from my own life right now. My mum is not doing so well at the moment. Sadly, I live several hours drive away from her, but her neighbours have been absolutely fantastic in supporting her when she's been unwell recently. You know, not genetic relationships, but they have really gone, you know, above and beyond to help out my family, which is so kind and generous of them.
I definitely agree, and I think for my culture, speaking for myself, that's something I've noticed too. Growing up, there's very much an extended family who might sometimes are not related by blood. It's just friends of families who really been there for us through difficulties and everything. We've been there for them, and I think that kind of that community, is the phrase. It takes a village to raise a child, and I think that's very much true in cultures. The reason for my question was more to talk about the differences that we notice in kind of the family structures. So, for example, if I would speak from my culture, there is a very much a matriarchy, where at the top is the grandmother, and then the mother that can then kind of respects towards that kind of like structure. Is that something you've seen in the research that shows that in certain cultures they might have a certain setup of family as opposed to other cultures, and is there any differences there?
Yeah, again, there are maybe some differences between matrilineal and patrilineal cultures. There are residence patterns can be different, for example. So typically what happens when a couple sets up a family home, they will either go and live with the father's family or the mother's family. More and more over time, they would form their own separate household, which is what we tend to do, in the UK at the moment. But when you have those different residence patterns, you'll be interacting with different relatives. So if you go and live with your husband's family when you get married as a young woman, for example, you and your husband lives a long way from your own family, you will inevitably be interacting more with your husband's family and seeing less of your mother's family. So that may be an opportunity where your mother-in-law might be a little bit more important in your day-to-day life, at least, than your mother. Although I think we can sometimes overestimate the differences between, for example, matrilineal and patrilineal societies. Often women retain really strong links with their mothers and their natal family, their birth family, even if they move to their husbands, even if that's quite a long distance away. There are often traditions where women go back and live with their mum, for example, when they give birth to their first child, because their mum can give them a lot of support around that difficult but exciting and important transition. So yes, there are some differences, but there are a lot of similarities as well.
That's so interesting. That's so interesting. That actually brings up a point in my mind. What are the changes you think has happened over time? So if we talk about like hunter-gatherer society compared to, let's say, the West family structures, are there any changes in how we set up our families or how we relate with each other to the wider society?
Yeah, there has definitely been that shift towards the nuclear families, and I think this may have started perhaps with agriculture a little bit. So we've been hunter-gatherers for most of our 200,000-year history, but around 10, 12,000 years ago, hunter-gatherers started to settle and they started to farm and herd animals. So this is it's called a Neolithic revolution, when we shifted from being hunter-gatherers largely to farmers and animal herders. That was a huge change in the way that we made a living, the way we gathered our food, and it likely also affected our social relationships. And I think it began to move to a more nuclear family then. Hunter-gatherers, they often have quite wide cooperative networks. They tend to live in groups, although hunter-gatherers are hugely diverse as well. So I shouldn't make too many generalizations about hunter-gatherers. Hunter-gatherer anthropologists will be cross at me if I make too many generalizations about hunter-gatherers. But I think it's fair to say that they often have quite large cooperative networks. With the shift to farming, it may have been that closer family became more important, maybe not just the nuclear family, but your direct relatives, so parents and grandparents and brothers and sisters. So I think there has been a general trend over time, not just in recent years, for perhaps the family to shrink, for these cooperative relationships to shrink a bit. And then with the Industrial Revolution particularly, it became very focused on the nuclear family, just the parents and children. And I think one reason that shift happened, probably roughly associated with the Industrial Revolution, is that what happened with the Industrial Revolution is that basically we became richer. We were extracting energy from the environment more easily, and that makes it easier for a male breadwinner to support a family. One reason why hunter-gatherers have large cooperative networks is that one hunter may be unsuccessful quite often on the hunt. But if you have large cooperative networks, you can share food a lot. If you have a safe, solid, relatively high income, you can rely just on a male breadwinner to feed a family. It's always a risky approach. The nuclear family has not been popular throughout most of human history because it is so risky. If anything happens to that male breadwinner, the whole family becomes destitute. So it's really only even a little bit feasible when we become sufficiently rich that a single person can guarantee to be able to feed a wife and children, mother and children, as well as himself.
I also want to look at the development, the human development, what that means. So you're talking about the shrinking, and I want to stay in that for a minute. The shrinking to nuclear family. What are some of have you found the things that have happened to human development? Let's say, for example, children. How have children developing and now in this kind of structure where they're not able to go out and their uncles and extend the family around them to kind of like, I guess, raise them? what are some of the changes we see in how people developed in that structure?
So there are differences in the way children interact in the different family structures. Just as an example, there's an interesting study that compared the way children picked up language, how they learned to speak in different types of families. Unfortunately, I'm forgetting the name of the anthropologist that did the study, but in more extended family networks where you have these larger families, there often isn't that much infant-directed speech. So mothers don't necessarily talk directly to the child. In contemporary Western societies, mothers are often very deliberately interacting, talking to their child to make sure they are learning to speak, that they are developing in the way that the mother or the parents want them to develop. When you have these extended family networks, in some cultures at least, there is less infant-directed speech, but kids are still picking up language very easily. And that seems to be because they are surrounded by people who are talking all of the time. So the kid just has to listen to what's happening around them and pick up language that way. When you have a nuclear family structure, especially the nuclear family structure where parents and children tend to live alone without other people around, the parents essentially have to be interacting with the child because there's nobody else around to teach the kid language. So there are differences in the way we interact with children in different family structures. And that's an example where kids are able to learn language quite well, even though their interactions with others are different. But there may be cases where development will be different in different family structures. And Sarah Hrdy, who's a really brilliant anthropologist who's written wonderful books about cooperative reproduction strategy, how we raise children with the village. She ends one of her books with a rather worrying warning about what will happen if children are raised without the support of these large family community networks. She says something like, the ability for empathy and compassion may fade away as sight does in cave-dwelling fish. Because if children are not raised in these cooperative networks, they don't learn the skills to be cooperative, which I think is perhaps a worrying vision of our future. I don't think we're there yet. Kids are still being raised, not just by parents, by other individuals too, but that's potentially a warning for our future.
First of all, that's a brilliant line to end the book. That's such a poetic line. But yeah, no, I think often about that too. About the effect how the family is being structured now and the effect it has on kids and how they socialize and even relating to other people. Obviously we see the rise in anxiety. I'm not sure if that's down to that, but I think that definitely has a part in it. Can you talk to me about that where certain emotions or like anxiety or like fear like relating to other people might be heightened because of how families are structured? Do you think there's any correlation there?
I think it's possible, although I should also say this is really on the edges of my expertise now. I'm not an expert in anxiety or mental health in general. But I think it is perhaps plausible that if children aren't really being raised by large cooperative networks in early childhood, they're just not used to interacting with other people. That's what happens in very early childhood may possibly have an impact later on. And I think it is great for kids to learn to interact with others from quite an early age. But then we do also have things like daycare at the moment, schooling, nurseries. These are opportunities for kids to learn those skills. So maybe it's not to do with our family structure rising anxiety. Maybe it is other things as well. There is plenty of stuff going on out there in the world at the moment to make us anxious. So maybe it's not just family structure.
Mm-mm. You research alloparenting and cooperative breeding. Could you talk to me a little bit more about how important you think other caregivers are to human well-being into just keeping us, I guess, on that path of development, and those things. Alloparenting. Could you also give me a little bit of definition what alloparenting and corporate breeding mean for us, please?
Yeah, so alloparenting means parenting from people who are not the parents. Allo means other in Greek, so it just means others than the parents. So anybody who does childcare rather, who isn't a mother or father of the child. Very common in our species because we do raise our kids in these cooperative networks, and that includes grandparents. Older siblings often do a lot of allo care. Again, this is even true in Western societies. We did some research during the COVID lockdown about what essentially what was happening to families. So this was we asked people to fill in a survey asking who was caring for their kids. And unsurprisingly, we found that networks became even more nuclear. These alloparenting networks became even more nuclear during COVID lockdowns because kids were getting less care from their grandparents who maybe, lived in a different town and couldn't visit. But care from siblings, older siblings of the child, went up because they're all living together. So alloparenting from older siblings is really very common. It's been very common throughout human history, but it's still common today. And it's one way in which we learn parenting skills, I think. We're going to get onto fertility a bit later, but maybe to jump ahead, I think perhaps one reason for low fertility these days, just one, it's a complex issue, is that we're not learning parenting skills so much anymore as children, which we've always done in the past. But that's what alloparenting is. Cooperative breeding is the term used when individuals other than the parents help to raise children. It's a term from biology. Not many animal species do it, but a few of them do. I think a little bit less than 10% of bird species do it. And there it's typically, again, older siblings of the babies in the nest who are staying around to help parents raise the kids. That's cooperative breeding. I tend to move away from that terminology these days because it sounds a little bit dehumanizing, cooperative breeding. So I tend to use the term cooperative reproduction right now. But another technical reason why I move away from the term is that some biologists use it for a very specific type of cooperative breeding, which humans don't actually do. There are some requirements, that don't quite fit that definition of humans. But basically raising children by a village rather than just the parents.
I want to talk also about how lasting you think this kind of change, as you mentioned, we've kind of seen a change in how families are and become much more smaller and smaller. And, you mentioned also that might be development, that might be due to how as a society we might become richer and, richer societies are more able to do this. And so this might be a thing where as our society gets richer, hopefully we might see this become more common. But my question is are we designed to exist this way? How likely is it's going to be a thing that stays for the future, or do you think it's a kind of like a result of our current living structure, and as we have more time to spend with our family and we have more time to be around people, we might return back to that kind of communal kind of raising of children?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I don't know what the answer to it is, but I essentially do think we are designed to be cooperative. We're a social species. We can't exist on our own. We don't like being on our own all the time, most of us at least. So I think we're never going to lose that. We're a social species. That's how we've evolved. Natural selection has shaped our psychology to be social. But we are social in different ways. We do have a lot of flexibility in our behavior too. Fundamentally we're social, but the exact social relationships we have are quite different between cultures and between individuals as well. I guess I might hope we would go back to a less individualistic culture in the future. I think this is an issue as well related to the nuclearization of families. We are becoming a much more individualistic society. It's all about self rather than how we can exist together as a team. And I would like to think we move away from that focus on individualism in the future. Whether it's going to happen, I just don't know.
Yeah, I agree. Speaking from experience, having grown up in a kind of like pre-technology and also post-technology kind of world, that kind of individualism has really become prevalent over the last couple of years. And I've seen it amongst my friends, isolation, anxiety, all these things on the rise because we feel disconnected from the world around us, even though we're connected online. And I think I see for the next generation too, that might be the same kind of problem they will have, where they feel connected online, but it's very difficult for them to connect to people around them. And I think a large part of that is how our families are structured. We're not as relatable as we are to each other, because just because of how difficult everything is. I remember like when I was younger back in the day, you'd go up, family around the table eating, that kind of like structure, and be outside playing, people be raising me but that's very different from now because of how the lack of trust in society might be now. We've changed how we kind of relate to the wider community, and community seems to be disappearing too. So yeah, I think I agree with you. That individualistic path that we're on, may cause some problems down the line, which you'll see us kind of bring it back. But on that point, actually, I wanted to talk about something you well touches on, which is the theory of mind and cooperation. So how does our ability to understand other people shape how we kind of understand family and community? Do you think?
Uh, that's an interesting question. So, theory of mind is the ability to understand that other people think different things to you. It's a way of understanding other people's minds, sometimes referred to as mind reading. I'm not sure that's a very good term because we can't really read other people's minds. But we are better at understanding other people's behavior. Again, I'm going to go back to the example of a cat. Cats are solitary. They don't need to interact very much with other cats. So they don't need skills that allow them to interact with other cats mostly. As humans, because we're social, the ability to interpret other people's behavior is really important in helping us work together with those people. I think theory of mind really does help us interact with our family members because it allows us to better interpret what other people are thinking, the way that they're behaving. If you want to be a social species, to interact with other people from your own species, it's easier to do that if you can have some idea of why they're behaving the way they do and how they might behave in the future. So the ability to understand other people's minds a little bit, I think, is really key in helping us be a cooperative species. And that means cooperate within the family and also with the wider community.
How does our relationship with family members reflect our relationship with others? You mentioned about how understanding that they also other people still have emotions, and I'm pretty sure the first way we learn that is through family members understanding mothers and fathers or brothers and sisters. What are the differences, do you think, about relation? Or do you think that's kind of like the same kind of track?
I think family relationships are where you learn those skills of interacting with others. But I think one thing we all, well, maybe I shouldn't speak for all of us, but many of us realize when, as we grow up as children and start interacting with many people outside the household, interacting with people outside your household is not quite the same as interacting with your mum. So you do have to learn to interact with a range of different people. You have different roles in your life, and different responsibilities, and who behave in different ways. So yeah, family is where you learn these skills, but you also have to learn to interact with different types of people in appropriate ways.
Yeah, no, I definitely see that. And I also see like the formation of community in that. I feel like once we start to relate to other people, we start to trust them. And in the trust web society, we can trade, we can build, relationships that last. And I feel like that community also kind of helps us not feel isolated. So can you speak to me more about like what is lost when community disappears as on an individual level? What have you seen from the research when people go from a community-centered culture or to an individualistic centered culture?
So communities and cultures are really important for humans because trial and error learning, which is what you have to do if you're a social animal, a solitary animal. It takes a long time to learn how to do something. If you have to learn it through trial and error, you often keep getting things wrong until you get it right. I've said that cooperation is one of the secrets of human success. What that allows us to do is learn very easily from other people. So rather than learn how to do things through trial and error, you can just look at what people around you are doing and learn how to hunt or gather or count or speak or whatever it is that you need to do. And that really makes us successful. In the field of cultural evolution, there's this idea of cumulative culture, where we don't just learn from other people, but we can build on what past people essentially have done as well. This ability to accumulate, for example, technological advances, really has made us very successful as a species. And that only comes from community. If you're an individual who insists on being solitary and refuses to learn from other people, that's not a very efficient way of being a human, in my opinion, or at least it's not how humans have been efficient in the past. So I do think there are dangers to individualism, yeah.
Yeah, I think we often overestimate individualism. I feel like a culture wants to be some people and you grow up there is a sense of self that comes with individualism, which is a positive, but I think there's also a sense of isolation with that self. what do you think? This might be a question outside of the field, but what do you think is the balance there, kind of like striking between individualism and also community? How do we merge the two and not lose the good aspects of both?
I think that's a good question. I'm not sure I have the answer to it. I'm not sure we're doing a good job at it right now. But I think you are absolutely right that individualism isn't entirely bad. I think there are positive things to having a sense of self. But I think you have to have a sense of self embedded in a sense that your family, your community is valuable to you. I think when you start to lose that sense that the community is valuable and that you're more important than everybody else, that's when it becomes a bit toxic. But yeah, you're absolutely right. A sense of self is important. We just need to balance it with a sense of community being important.
Mm. And speaking of community, what what have you found about what types of different types of communities that work best? Whether it's small groups or like king networks or like wider tribes or like nation states. What what level of community have you found in your research that work best?
I think it might depend on how you define works best, because obviously we have societies have become more and more complex over time. That's a simplification. That's very much a simplification. But hunter-gatherers communities started off as relatively simple with relatively small groups, although they have interactions with other groups. Hunter-gatherer societies did become more complex over time. Agricultural societies became even more complex, and now we have these nation states where we have these really complex societies, big divisions of labor. We really rely on other people to grow our food, to produce our electricity. All of the things that we need to live are done by many other people. We have these very complex societies. And in some ways, that has been a real success story. If you look at mortality, for example, then complex societies in which we have specialized doctors and nurses and medical researchers, for example, mortality rates are much, much lower than they used to be in the past. In the past, sadly, something like half of all children may not have survived childhood and made it to adulthood. In high-income countries today, that proportion of children who don't survive into adulthood is really tiny. So in some senses, these complex states have been incredibly successful, but I think they do have their downsides as well, because they've come along with this shift towards individualism, which is perhaps isn't ideal, and may not make us too happy some of the time. Not that natural selection shapes us to be happy. That's not really the end goal of natural selection.
Or sidebar then, what is the end goal of natural selection, you would say?
Well, there is no end goal of natural selection. I shouldn't use that language at all. Natural selection is blind. Natural selection selects adaptations which happen to be useful in a particular context. There's no end goal there. But what makes particular strategies successful is reproducing themselves, essentially, not making themselves happy. So successful strategies in the context of natural selection are those in which allow people to survive better and have children more successfully. And that's why we do, I think, sometimes do things which don't make us happy or healthy, for that matter, because our psychology and our physiology too has been shaped by natural selection, which shapes us to be successful in terms of reproductive success, producing children, rather than being happy or healthy.
Yeah, it was a shock to me too when I learned that you were evolutionary adapted to produce children rather than be happy, and so sometimes you butt heads with your own kind of evolutionary traits and reasons why you do things, and so on. On fertility now, we want to now touch a little bit on that too. I'm fascinated by this topic because I see there is and correct me if I'm wrong, but there's a shift towards a reduction in birth rates, a reduction in birth rates, a reduction in people having kids, and I think coming back to what we talked about before about how alloparenting has now shrunk. It's like there's less people having help when raising children and birthing children. I think there's a lot of people now seeing that and seeing parenting as very difficult and not wanting to be no not wanting to go through that alone. Can you talk to me about the changes and how parenting is done has affected fertility rates?
Yes, actually, I'll answer that question in a minute. I just wanted to pick up keep the conversation going about natural selection and happiness. I think, yeah, you were saying that sometimes our evolved tendencies are, butting heads with our desire to be happy. I think it's absolutely fine to want to be happy and healthy. I think it's perfectly fine to have those goals yourself. We shouldn't worry too much about what natural selection has designed us to do. That shouldn't dictate how we live our daily lives. If we want to be happy, then we should absolutely go out there and make sure we are happy and do whatever it takes to get us there. But yes, to answer your question about fertility, do the way we raise children today, is that affecting our fertility? That's your question, right?
Yes.
I think that's a very plausible answer. Fertility rates are declining. So they've been declining in the UK at least since around the middle of the 19th century. So fertility decline is a long process. And it has really complex causes because the issue of fertility itself, fertility decision making, is an incredibly complex thing. Don't know if you're aware, but roughly a little bit under half of all births worldwide are unintended. So a report came out from the UN a few years ago showing that about 45% of pregnancies worldwide are unintended. And part of that is because women and men in some contexts don't have access to good contraception. But a lot of that is also in higher income contexts where people do have access to good contraception, but they're just a bit ambivalent about having kids. So, there are some people who really, really don't want to have a child right now. And there are some people who really, really do want to have a child right now. But there's a big grey area in the middle. And I think a lot of unintended pregnancies are happening in that grey area. Unintended, incidentally, doesn't mean unwanted. Many of those people, when they find out they're pregnant, are absolutely delighted and go ahead with the pregnancy and, have the baby. So fertility decision-making is incredibly complex. The reasons for fertility decline are incredibly complex. But I think if you're talking about recent declines in fertility, it does seem likely, plausible to me that the way we organize our families and raise children now is at least part of the reason for fertility decline. Partly is the reason I just said that we're not really gaining much experience now as children of parenting, of raising kids. So we're losing those skills. I think the thought of becoming a parent, if you've essentially had very little contact with babies and small children until you have your own, is quite daunting. People they genuinely don't really know what to do. And again, this comes back to us being a species which relies on social learning from other people in order to do everything. That includes parenting. You're not born with the ability to know how to parent. Even something like breastfeeding is actually really difficult to do if you're not taught to do it, if you don't have support around you. There's a really interesting paper just published by Brooke Skelzer, who works in the Himba pastoralist community in Namibia. They're living quite a traditional lifestyle, but even there, women really need a lot of social support to breastfeed successfully. You would think that something like breastfeeding ought to come very naturally because it's so important. But even that in our species, it's really important to have people around us teaching us how to do it, supporting us how to do that. And we have a lot less of that social support the way we organize our family lives these days. I also think the nuclear family feeds into this because the nuclear family puts a lot more pressure on parents alone to raise children. If you have these big cooperative networks around you who can help out with childcare, raising children is much easier. If parents alone, pretty much alone, have to raise kids, it's much harder to do that. So yes, I think the answer to your question is yes. The way we organize our families now probably is feeding into low fertility.
Yeah, and I think I've seen that from my perspective, from my experience too, because I think growing up, I was very much around kids all the time. I was looking after nephews and cousins, and so I have this kind of instance that I want my own kids, I want children myself. I think you're right. I think that comes from being around them and seeing being kind of taught how to raise kids. I think another aspect of it too, if I was to think more economically, is that there's loads of economic pressures. You mentioned about the nuclear family. I think right now for a new generation coming up, they feel like it's hard to get home. It's hard to, all these economic pressures kind of dictate or like, kind of give an idea that, parenting might be too difficult. Question I have you found, is there anything you found in the data about maybe that, about how economic pressures sometimes will dictate that, or even thinking about how other cultures and in outside the West, has that affected fertility there too, or?
Yeah, definitely economic factors are really, really important and are definitely another reason for why fertility has declined. There's a lot of work in the literature about how the costs and benefits of raising children change um, in different types of society. Um, in most traditional societies, both hunter-gatherer societies and agricultural or animal herding societies, children are helping out from quite a young age. In contemporary society, they go to school. So children are not contributing very much to the family. In the past, they always did. And that, to be clear, that's not exploitation. That's how kids learn how to do things. Just as they learn how to parent by caring for their younger siblings, they learn how to become a hunter-gatherer or how to farm or herd animals by starting to do that as a child from a young age and just learning those skills on the job. We learn our skills very differently. We're, isolated in schools where we have to learn specific skills. So kids are no longer contributing to the family economy. That is very likely a big reason why fertility started to decline, because kids just become more expensive to raise. Move to contemporary societies. I think you're right. The contemporary societies as well. There is some evidence that economic uncertainty, precarity, decreases fertility intentions and possibly fertility. And that is one shift, I think, recently that is happening economically. It is getting harder to get on the housing ladder. There's an increase in the gig economy. There's there are fewer stable, well-paid jobs around, I guess, essentially. So economic factors, economic uncertainty in contemporary societies, I think is very likely also to be feeding into low fertility.
Oh, well, that's a fascinating point you made about the skills and how, like family economy and that aspect of that we don't really have there in the West anymore. As you mentioned, you're going to school and then maybe it's delayed by 18 years if there's any going to be any economic kind of profit, let's say. That's a fascinating thing how that would affect maybe the initial decision to have kids or the initial how many kids you do have initially, because the cost of it is so much more backloaded than the front end. The question I have actually, I found in my research that you've also done some work in Ethiopia. Could you tell me more about some of the work, if you would like to, that you've done in Ethiopia, what you're trying to do there, what you found there when you went there, and what you're trying to get people to understand about the work you're doing?
So that project was a project headed up by a PhD student, Rose Stevens. I should not give myself too much credit at all for this piece of work. I was only quite lightly involved as one of her PhD supervisors. Alex Alverne is the anthropologist who is also leading some of this research. But what Rose and Alex were interested in, I think they had a really fascinating idea here. It was about contraceptive use in Ethiopia. And why women discontinue, why they stop using contraception. There are sometimes quite high rates of women stopping contraception, not just in lower income contexts, but in lower income contexts too. And there's sometimes a belief in public health and development workers that this is a problem. It's because women don't really understand contraception. They may have, misconceptions, inaccurate beliefs about contraception maybe affecting their future fertility. So there are these negative stereotypes perhaps around why women stop using contraception in countries like Ethiopia. What Rose and Alex wanted to look at was women's hormonal profiles. So if you look at reproductive hormones in different contexts, they are much higher in Western contexts where people are well-fed, well-nourished, and when they have good medical care. Some parts of Ethiopia, people are still subsistence farmers. They have there is access to medical care, but it's not always as good as it is in high-income contexts, and people may be less well-nourished as well. And their argument was that hormonal contraception, which is what many of these women are on, is designed for well-fed Western women. And it may effectively be at too high a dose for women in different contexts who may have lower levels of reproductive hormones. That means that if you give hormonal contraception to women whose bodies are not designed for it, essentially you're giving them too high a dose of these hormones, they may react to it badly. They may have side effects. They may have a lot of side effects. So what Rose and Alex wanted to do was actually collect some hormonal data to test this hypothesis, to see whether whether side effects were whether the side effects that women were reporting were associated with their hormonal profiles. Unfortunately, COVID happened just as Rose was going to go out to collect data, working with Ashetu Gurmu, who's a demographer in Ethiopia as well, involved in the project. So she wasn't actually able to test that hypothesis. But what she did with Ashetu and Alex and others was gather a lot of data about side effects and try and relate it to women's health and other characteristics that women were reporting. And it does seem like women who are less well nourished may be more likely to report side effects after using contraception, which does support this idea perhaps that the contraception isn't well designed for women who are not so well nourished. Hopefully in the future they will be able to measure hormones themselves. But yeah, the basic idea is that hormonal contraception is not designed for a lot of women, and that perhaps you should believe these women when they are reporting side effects and stopping the use of contraception rather than simply dismissing their side effects as a misconception, an incorrect belief.
That's so fascinating. That is so fascinating. I'm very much kind of like interested in like these kind of studies and stuff, because I have a lot of, obviously I've got sisters and I've got a lot of friends who kind of, will talk about the lack of information or lack of conversations about these things, and they're not aware of these things. Obviously they kind of, as you've grown up in culture, they're pretty, like, some semi-aware of it, but they don't understand the kind of the studies done behind and the side effects, all these things. Is there anything you can say about that, about fertility and any other studies that you think people maybe would be good for them to check out if they want to get more information and understand more about fertility and birth rates and so on?
That's a big question. I think when you start looking into the literature on things like hormonal contraception, it is a bit worrying how little we know about these issues. I mean, it's been used since the 60s now it's very hormonal contraceptive, the use of the pill and so on. It's very widespread, but it's a little bit frightening when you actually look at the literature on how little we know about these types of issues. I mean, the hypothesis that Rose and Alex and Ashetu were testing about hormonal contraception simply not being designed for women in many countries where it is very widely used. That seems like such an obvious hypothesis when you think about it for a few minutes, but it took, half a century for it to occur to anyone. In terms of other studies, I'm not quite sure how to answer that question. There are many interesting things I'm sure that could be talked about there.
Yeah, and it's my apologies. I put you on the spot there, but asking you to recall. But I just thought it was important because I do see that kind of that idea and that prevalent idea kind of, in conversations with my friends all the time, and obviously I have no understanding of the literature. So I thought, but I think it is good, like you say. I think it's important for people to do their own research and find out more about not just fertility, but everything we've talked about today in terms of community building, kind of family structures and all these things. But I think it will inform people in making a decision if they actually want to go forward with family. That gray area you talked about, with people not being sure or kind of ambivalent about having kids. I think a lot of that is due to just not research, just not understanding what they're getting themselves into, and not feeling one way or the other because they've not been convinced either they didn't grow up with kids, or they didn't have any reason to not want kids. I think a lot can be done in the field of just informing people when it comes to just that kind of thing. Another big question, which you again might have an answer to, is that we spoke a lot about fertility, we spoke a lot about like birth rates. From the data, what do you think can be done about the declining birth rates? How do you think we can, what are some of the levers we can pull, maybe to kind of maybe inform people, not to stop it radically, but to inform people about some of the reasons why birth rates are declining?
So I actually don't think we should do anything to stop the decline in birth rates, because I think once you see declining birth rates as a problem, that leads us down a very dangerous path. I think people should be absolutely free to decide however many children they want to have, whether or not to have kids. It should absolutely be everybody's individual choice. Governments shouldn't be interfering in those choices in order to get a benefit for society. Separately, there is a concern that some people are not fulfilling their fertility intentions. So across Europe, for example, if you ask people how many kids they want to have and how many kids they have had, there's a gap. People tend to say, on average, they want around 2 kids. But fertility rates have been below 2 kids per woman for decades now in many countries, since the 1970s in the UK. So there is a bit of a concern that people are not able to have the number of kids that they want to have, and we should absolutely support people to have the number of kids that they want to have. We should, for example, have generous maternity and paternity leave so that people can balance work and family, which is explicitly what people say they want to do. We should have cheap or free childcare, for example, to help people manage their family lives. So we absolutely have to have those family-friendly policies in place to support people's fertility intentions. We shouldn't worry about fertility itself. There's a past history of worrying about fertility, and it led to serious human rights abuses. So in the 60s and 70s, people became very concerned about overpopulation, about there being too many people on the planet. So after the Second World War, global population growth shot up. It really is quite astonishing if you actually look at the numbers. There's a Guardian website where you can put in your date of birth, and it will tell you how many people were on the planet the day you were born. So when I do this, it comes up with a figure of 3.7 billion people. Do you know what the current global population is?
I think it's around 9 billion, isn't it?
8.1, so close, but yeah, a little bit lower. But yeah, so in the time that I've been on the planet, global population has more than doubled. And I'm no longer young, but still, I haven't been on the planet very long in the grand scheme of things. So over the past few decades, global population growth has been incredibly rapid. And in the 60s, 70s, 80s, people were very concerned about this. And governments and international organizations explicitly tried population control. So they tried to reduce fertility rates. In those decades, high fertility rates were in lower and middle income contexts. So this was very largely happening in poorer and middle income countries, not high income countries. But the impetus was often coming from high income countries who wanted to control population. You may know about the forced sterilization campaigns in India, for example. This is very well known. So the Indian government decided that they were going to control their population by really forcing people to be sterilized against their will, sometimes against their knowledge. That is obviously a very serious violation of people's human rights. It also led to deaths because sometimes these practices were not done in the most hygienic, the best practice way. So the overpopulation panic led to really serious consequences. If you worry about the population, you lose sight of individual human rights. And if we now start to worry about low fertility, the same thing is going to happen. If we say we have to implement policies to increase fertility, you're focusing on the population level, what's good for the population, not what's good for people. And that is a very dangerous slope to go down.
That is a brilliant point. Thank you for that. Yeah, it's a fantastic point. I never thought of that because there is so much talk right now about underpopulation, but I think in that loss, you lose the individual, you lose the people that you're talking about. So yeah, thank you for that. It's really well said. I did want to mention another slightly difficult topic, but I want people to understand a little bit more about it. One of some of your research, you kind of also research eugenics and kind of scientific, I guess, there's something I don't even know how to phrase it, but like the way that science is used in certain types of ways. Is there a way you can kind of inform us a little bit on what eugenics is and the dangers of that kind of ideology?
So eugenics essentially comes out of the same idea that we should care about the population and not individual people. So eugenics is the idea that human populations can be improved through social policies such as preventing some people from reproducing and encouraging other people from reproducing, from preventing some people from migrating into your population, based on the assumption that not everybody has equal value to society. So the idea behind eugenics is that some people are just inherently better than others, some people are superior, and some people are inherently inferior. And we have to arrange society so that we encourage superior people to have children, to live and survive well. Inferior people should be discouraged from reproduction. If they're outside your national borders, you should not let them migrate in. And the Nazi regime, we know, took these ideas to their obvious conclusion, and they murdered inferior people in horrifyingly large numbers. The Holocaust against the Jewish population killed likely 6 million Jews. They also targeted people such as disabled people. many other groups, Roma groups as well. So eugenics is a very dangerous ideology, and it's based on faulty science. So what eugenicists believe is that some people are inherently genetically better than others. Often eugenicists are obsessed with intelligence. Eugenicists think that certain people are inherently more intelligent than others, and in fact, certain groups of people are inherently more intelligent than others. And a lot of this is focused on race. So eugenicists often believe that white people are genetically more intelligent than Black people, for example. That is scientifically indefensible. Race is not a biological or genetically meaningful concept. There is obviously genetic variation amongst humans, but it doesn't sort itself into clusters, racial clusters. Genetic variation is it's called clinal, so it's gradual variation between populations. It's not clustered variation. So race has no biological meaning. If race has no biological meaning, it simply can't be the case that white people are genetically more intelligent than Black people. That's a nonsensical thing to say from a scientific point of view. But eugenicists believe this, and they say that, what they're saying, and what contemporary eugenicists are saying, for example, is that Black people shouldn't be allowed to migrate into white countries, majority white countries, because they will reduce the intelligence of those populations. Eugenics was very popular in the early 20th century in places like the US and the UK, not just Nazi Germany, but it fell out of favor. At least it appeared to fall out of favor. The ideas underlying it never really went away. But particularly after the Nazi regime, eugenics became a dirty word because it was associated with the Nazi regime. But it's never gone away, and it's really now coming back onto the political agenda. There are people who are now very explicitly making statements like, Black and white people are genetically different, and we must have social policies to account for this fact.
Thank you for that. I know that's it's difficult to have these conversations because there's so much. It's so much difficult because the words, you have to pick your words carefully, but I think it's very important we have these conversations, like you mentioned, because when the conversation goes away, then the people is filled by other people with kind of ideas who kind of they claim to be scientific ideas when we know that that's not true. So thank you for that. That was very, very important, and I'm sure my audience will take that, and I'll encourage people to learn more about eugenics, because when I also learned about it, I knew the word, but I didn't understand the depth and how prevalent it is in some ideologies and things like that. So that was very well said too. I also want to close off by giving some people some solutions. We've talked about a lot of problems and a lot of ways kind of things have changed over time, from community to kind of family to kind of fertility. So coming back onto community, what are some of the from scientific data? What are some forms of community support that you think people can kind of recapture, and like what are the benefits of that? To kind of reinstill that in people's minds.
I think benefits of community are great, and I think people should make much more use of their communities and make sure they are building communities wherever they are. It is more difficult as we're more mobile, as we're more isolated in our homes, but it's always possible to build different types of community. Again, there's this idea that we are now building our own families rather than just relying on genetic relatives, which I think is absolutely true. And I think that does give us cause for optimism. We are this cooperative species. We have these skills at getting along with each other. These are not skills that a lot of other animals have. And I think we should, celebrate that. Sarah Hddy starts one of her books with this chapter called Apes on a Plane. She invites us to think about, a Boeing 747 that's filled with chimpanzees. And you can imagine what that would be like. The chimpanzees would be fighting each other, they would not get to their destination without some serious carnage going on, because chimpanzees don't have the skills that humans do in cooperation. Flying is a really unpleasant experience. You're crammed into this, horrible little tube with loads of people that you don't know. And yet most flights are, get to their destination with everyone being perfectly satisfied, nobody breaking out into fights. Occasionally that does happen, but it's very rare. We have these skills in cooperating with other people, in building these communities, and I think we really need to make sure that we are working on those skills so that we don't lose them. But that ought to be an easy thing to do, right? Because we do have these skills. I'm going to do something that I tell people not to do, but saying natural selection has given us these skills. And that is something that we should actually celebrate and make sure we don't lose.
I completely agree. And I think people feel better. I work in a lot of event spaces, and just to see community coming back that way, with people being in community and sharing, whether it's poetry or whatever they share with each other, they kind of feel like, oh, this is amazing. I missed this. And it's like, you are right. We're kind of, natural selection has kind of left that little bit to build of like joy within us when we're in communities and we share and we kind of feel that bonding again. And we shouldn't let these technologies take this away, or not even take technologies, the advancements of certain kind of like our, whether it's family structures or economy or technology, we shouldn't let that take away from us, because yeah, we lose something in that. Um, and on the topic of hope, actually, in all your research, what gives you hope? What gives you hope about whether it's families, communities, human development? I like to end my episode with just kind of a little kind of tidbit about what from what you found gives you hope about humans in general.
I think that we are still here and that we are still interacting with each other, largely in positive ways, certainly in our day-to-day interactions. Again, if you look back at that incredible increase in population during the 20th century, that really, I cannot emphasize how incredible that increase in population was. And there was all of this doom and gloom after the Second World War, that there was going to be mass starvation and this was going to bring disaster to the human race. We're still here. We're doing well. We're fine. We are a really innovative, cooperative species. We overcome our problems. That's what we've done for 200,000 years. And I don't see why we shouldn't continue to do that.
That's brilliant. That's amazing. Thank you very much, Dr. Rebecca Sear. This has been very informative for me, and I've 100% completely enjoyed this conversation. Is there anywhere my guests can find, my audience can find you? Is there anything that you would be doing next? Is there anything that you would point them in your kind of research so they can check you out?
I think I'm quite easy to find online. I'm also quite active on Blue Sky, a social media platform. You talk about technology. One of the interesting things about technology to me is how we've used it to build social networks, because we're a social species and that's what we like to do. So yeah, I'm out there on social networks like Blue Sky as well, if people want to find me there.
That's amazing. Thank you very much for your time today. And
Yeah.
thank you guys. Until next time. Peace.